The winter wind howled across the Montana territory like a wounded animal, but Thomas Zachary barely noticed as he rode alongside the swollen river. It was 1873, and the harsh December had turned the usually gentle waters of the Blackfoot River into a churning mass of ice and fury. Through the biting gale, a sound reached his ears that didn't belong, a woman's desperate cry, nearly drowned out by the rushing water and whistling wind. Thomas yanked on the reins of his chestnut stallion, bringing the animal to an abrupt halt. He tilted his head, wondering if the sound had been a trick of the wind or perhaps a mountain lion in the distance. Then it came again, unmistakable this time, a human cry for help. "Whoa, Rusty," he murmured to his horse, dismounting swiftly. The cold bit through his leather gloves as he tied the reins to a nearby pine. The cry came once more, weaker this time, and Thomas bolted toward the riverbank. There, clinging desperately to a half-submerged log, was a young woman. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale face, her lips already turning blue from the freezing water. The current tugged at her violently, threatening to tear her grip from the log at any moment. "Hold on," Thomas shouted, already shrugging off his heavy coat. He kept his boots on. He'd need the traction, but removed his gun, belt, and hat, dropping them onto the snowy bank. The woman's eyes widened when she saw him, a flicker of hope crossing her face before another wave of water crashed over her. Her grip slipped, and she let out another desperate cry. Thomas didn't hesitate. He waded into the freezing water, gasping as the cold seized his muscles. The current immediately pushed against him, stronger than he'd anticipated. The rocky riverbed was treacherous, slick with ice and uneven. He struggled forward, each step a battle against the force of nature itself. "I'm coming," he called, seeing her fingers slipping further. "Just hold on a moment longer." By the time he reached her, the woman was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, were losing their grip on the log. Thomas lunged forward, grabbing her around the waist just as she let go. The current immediately swept them both downstream. Thomas fought against the pull, kicking with all his might toward the shore while keeping the woman's head above water. Her body was limp in his arms, dead weight that threatened to drag them both under. His foot caught on something solid, a rock, perhaps, and he used it to push off toward the bank. With one final surge of strength, Thomas heaved them both onto the muddy shore, collapsing onto his back with the woman sprawled across his chest. For a moment, he simply lay there, gasping for breath, the cold air burning his lungs. Then reality snapped back into focus. The woman wasn't moving. "Madam," Thomas rolled her gently onto her back, brushing wet hair from her face. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with delicate features that were now alarmingly pale. Her lips had a bluish tinge that frightened him. "Madam, can you hear me?" When she didn't respond, Thomas pressed his ear to her chest. Her heartbeat was there, but faint. She wasn't breathing. Without hesitation, he tilted her head back and pressed his mouth to hers, forcing air into her lungs the way his father, an army medic, had taught him years ago. He pulled back, watched her chest fall, then repeated the action. On the third breath, the woman suddenly convulsed, turning to her side as water spewed from her mouth. She coughed violently, her entire body shaking. "That's it," Thomas encouraged, supporting her shoulders. "Get it all out." When the coughing subsided, she collapsed back against him, shivering uncontrollably. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of summer sage. Thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. "Don't thank me yet, madam. We need to get you warm, or saving you from that river won't mean much." Thomas stood, scooping her into his arms. She weighed hardly anything, even with her sodden clothes. "My horse is just up there. Can you hold on while I climb up?" She nodded weakly, wrapping her arms around his neck. Thomas retrieved his coat and draped it over her before gathering his other belongings. The woman's shivering had intensified, her body desperately trying to generate heat. "What's your name?" he asked, hoping to keep her conscious as he carried her up the steep bank. "Lillian," she stammered. "Lillian Davies. I'm Thomas Zachary. Most folks call me Tom." He reached his horse, who nickered nervously at the scent of the river on them. "Steady, Rusty. We've got precious cargo." With some difficulty, he managed to mount while still holding Lillian. He positioned her in front of him, wrapped in his coat, and kicked Rusty into motion. "My cabin's not far," he told her, urging the horse to a swift trot. "Just hold on a bit longer, Miss Davies." Lillian leaned back against his chest, her wet hair soaking through his shirt. "How did you find me?" she asked through chattering teeth. "Heard you calling. Lucky I was riding near enough to the river." Thomas guided Rusty through a stand of pines, taking a shortcut he knew would lead them to his homestead faster. "What happened? How'd you end up in the water?" Lillian's voice was faint, nearly lost to the wind. "The B bridge. It collapsed under my wagon, my horse." Her words trailed off as her head lolled against his chest. "Miss Davies? Lillian?" Thomas gave her a gentle shake, but she didn't respond. Unconsciousness had claimed her, and that was dangerous in her condition. "Rusty, we need to hurry." The horse seemed to understand the urgency, quickening his pace through the snow-covered landscape. Thomas held Lillian tighter, willing his own body heat to sustain her until they reached shelter. His cabin appeared through the trees just as the afternoon light began to wane. It was a sturdy structure of log and stone, small but well built, with smoke rising from the chimney. Thank God he'd banked the fire before leaving this morning. Thomas dismounted carefully, keeping Lillian secure in his arms. He kicked the door open and hurried inside, laying her gently on the bearskin rug in front of the hearth. The fire had burned low, but there were still glowing embers. He quickly added kindling and logs, blowing gently until flames leapt up once more. Lillian remained unconscious, her breathing shallow. Her clothes were soaked through, her skin like ice to the touch. Thomas knew what needed to be done, though the propriety of it made him hesitate. "Miss Davies," he said loudly, hoping she might wake. "Lillian, I need to remove your wet clothes. You'll die of cold otherwise." When she didn't stir, Thomas steeled himself and began the necessary but uncomfortable task. He removed her boots first, then her sodden wool coat. Her dress was more complicated, with tiny buttons that his cold fingers fumbled with. He worked quickly but respectfully, averting his eyes as much as possible while still ensuring he did what was needed to save her life. Once he had removed her outer garments, leaving her in her chemise and drawers, he wrapped her in every blanket he owned, placing her closer to the fire. Then he quickly changed out of his own wet clothes, donning dry trousers and a flannel shirt. He put water on to boil and prepared a strong cup of coffee, adding a generous splash of whiskey for good measure. When it was ready, he knelt beside Lillian, gently lifting her head. "Miss Davies, I need you to drink this," he coaxed, pressing the cup to her lips. Her eyelids fluttered and she moaned softly. He managed to get a few sips into her before her eyes opened fully. "Where?" she murmured, confusion clouding her face. "You're in my cabin. You fell into the river, remember? I pulled you out." Recognition dawned in her eyes, along with something else, alarm. She suddenly became aware of her state of undress beneath the blankets and clutched them tighter around herself. "My clothes, had to remove them," Thomas explained quickly. "You were freezing to death, Miss Davies." "I was as proper as the situation allowed." Lillian assessed him for a moment, her eyes still fever-bright but clearer than before. Something in his honest face must have reassured her because she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life. Twice now, it seems." Drink more of this, he urged, offering the cup again. It'll warm you from the inside. She complied, grimacing slightly at the strong taste. What is this? Coffee with a bit of medicine, he replied with the hint of a smile. Whiskey, you mean? A ghost of a smile touched her lips. My father used to give me the same when I had a chill. Your father sounds like a sensible man. Lillian's smile faded. He was. The past tense hung in the air between them. Thomas nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Loss was common in the territories. Few reached adulthood without experiencing it in some form. Are you hungry? He asked, changing the subject. I've got venison stew left from yesterday. Actually, yes. Lillian attempted to sit up further but winced, her body clearly aching from her ordeal. Here, let me help. Thomas arranged the pillows from his bed behind her back, creating a makeshift seat that allowed her to recline comfortably while still being upright enough to eat. He warmed the stew on the stove, then brought her a bowl with a chunk of cornbread on the side. Lillian ate slowly at first, then with increasing appetite as her body demanded fuel to recover. This is delicious, she said between bites. You're quite the cook for a bachelor. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Who says I'm a bachelor? Lillian froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. I just assumed. I mean, there's no sign of a woman's touch here, and she stopped, flushing with embarrassment. Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine. I'm teasing you, Miss Davies. Yes, I'm unmarried. Been on my own since I was 20. You learn to cook or you learn to starve. How old are you now, if you don't mind my asking? Turned 28 this past summer, he replied, settling into his chair with his own bowl of stew. And yourself? 23 last month. Lillian took another spoonful of stew, seeming to gather her thoughts. I should explain how I ended up in your river. It's not my river, Thomas corrected with a smile, though after today I might feel a certain responsibility toward it. Lillian returned his smile, some color finally returning to her cheeks. I was traveling to Fort Benton. My uncle lives there. He's the only family I have left after my parents passed last spring. Influenza. Thomas nodded solemnly. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. Lillian set her empty bowl aside. I sold our farm in Minnesota and decided to join Uncle Henry. He's getting older and has no children of his own, I thought. She trailed off, her gaze drifting toward the window where snow had begun to fall. Well, I thought we could be family for each other. That's admirable, Thomas said. Traveling alone through this country isn't easy, especially for a woman. I'm discovering that, Lillian replied ruefully. I was nearly to Fort Benton when I came to that wooden bridge over your Knot River. It looked solid enough, but halfway across, the timbers gave way. My wagon, my horse, everything I owned. Her voice broke slightly. Gone just like that. I managed to grab onto that log, but the current was so strong and the water so cold. You're lucky to be alive, Thomas said quietly, because of you. Lillian met his gaze directly, her green eyes still bright with fever but clear with sincerity. I would have died out there if you hadn't come along. Thomas shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said firmly. Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger. I won't forget it, Mr. Zachary. Tom, he corrected. If we're going to be snowed in together for who knows how long, you might as well use my given name. Lillian looked toward the window again, where the snow was indeed falling more heavily. How long do you think the storm will last? Hard to say. December storms in these parts can last hours or days. Thomas stood and added another log to the fire. But don't worry, I've got plenty of supplies. And as soon as it clears, I'll take you to Fort Benton myself. That's very kind, but I've imposed enough already. Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious. Miss Davies, your wagon is gone, your horse is gone, and from what I gather, so are all your possessions. How exactly were you planning to reach Fort Benton on your own? Lillian opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, the reality of her situation sinking in. I hadn't thought that far ahead, she admitted. Well, there's nothing to be done about it tonight anyway. You need rest to recover your strength. Thomas moved to his small chest of drawers and pulled out a clean flannel shirt. Here, you can wear this while your undergarments dry. I'll step outside while you change, then make up a bed for myself by the fire. You can take the bed. Lillian accepted the shirt with a grateful nod. Thank you, Tom. Thomas nodded and stepped out onto the small covered porch. The snow was coming down in thick flakes now, blanketing the world in white. Rusty was sheltered in the lean-to stable adjacent to the cabin, munching contentedly on hay. Thomas took a moment to check on the horse, making sure he had fresh water and was properly rubbed down after their urgent ride. By the time he returned to the cabin door, several minutes had passed, more than enough time for Lillian to have changed. Still, he knocked before entering. "It's safe," she called. Thomas opened the door to find Lillian sitting on the edge of his bed, his flannel shirt hanging loosely on her slender frame. She'd combed her fingers through her dark hair, which was beginning to dry in loose waves around her shoulders. Even pale and exhausted, there was something striking about her that made Thomas aware of his own unshaven face and rough appearance. "The storm's picking up," he said, closing the door against the cold. "We might be here a couple of days." Lillian nodded, looking down at her hands. "I've lost everything," she said quietly. "All the keepsakes from my parents, the money from the farm, everything." Thomas hesitated, then sat beside her on the bed, careful to maintain a respectable distance. "What's done is done. You're alive, and that's what matters. The rest can be replaced or rebuilt. I know you're right, but it still hurts." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I feel so foolish. I should never have attempted this journey alone." "You were brave to try," Thomas countered, "and determined to reach your family. There's nothing foolish in that." A tear slipped down Lillian's cheek, which she quickly wiped away. "You must think I'm terribly weak, crying over material things when you just saved my life." "I think you're remarkably strong," Thomas said honestly. "Most people would have given up in that river. You held on." He stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "You should get some rest now, doctor's orders." "Are you a doctor?" Lillian asked, a hint of surprise in her voice. Thomas shook his head. "No, but my father was a surgeon in the Union Army. I picked up a few things." "Where is he now, your father?" "Died at Antietam," Thomas replied, the old grief muted but still present. "Never came home from the war." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly. "And your mother passed a few years later. Tuberculosis." Thomas moved toward the fire, putting physical distance between them. "It was just me and my younger brother after that, but he headed to California 2 years ago. Writes occasionally when he remembers. So you're alone here." Thomas nodded, arranging blankets on the floor near the hearth. "By choice, I prefer the quiet, most days anyway." Lillian watched him prepare his makeshift bed. "I feel terrible taking your bed." "Don't. I've slept in worse places." He gave her a reassuring smile. "Now get some rest. Your body's been through an ordeal." Lillian nodded, sliding beneath the covers. "Good night, Tom, and thank you for everything." "Good night, Miss Davies." "Lillian," she corrected softly. "If we're to be snowed in together, you might as well use my given name too." Thomas nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Good night, Lillian." He waited until her breathing deepened before banking the fire for the night and settling onto his blankets. Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin was warm and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, not lonely. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit. The fire had burned low during the night and the cabin was chilly. He added logs quietly, careful not to disturb Lillian, who was still sleeping soundly in his bed. In the dim light of the newly rekindled fire, he studied her face. Her color was much improved, the bluish tinge of her lips replaced by a healthy pink. Her dark hair was spread across his pillow, and her features were relaxed in sleep. She was beautiful, he realized with a jolt. Not in the painted, artificial way of the women in saloons, but in a natural, unaffected manner that was far more compelling. Thomas looked away, chiding himself. She was under his protection, dependent on his help. Having such thoughts was inappropriate at best, dishonorable at worst. He busied himself with making coffee and preparing a simple breakfast of bacon and cornmeal mush. The familiar tasks helped ground him, pushing aside the unexpected attraction he'd felt. The smell of coffee and bacon eventually roused Lillian. She stirred, stretched, and sat up, looking momentarily confused before her eyes found Thomas by the stove. "Good morning," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. "Morning," Thomas replied, keeping his eyes on the bacon he was frying. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you." Lillian ran a hand through her tangled hair, attempting to smooth it. "Though I'm afraid I must look a fright." Thomas glanced at her then, unable to help himself. Even tousled from sleep, wearing his too large shirt, she was lovely. "You look fine," he said gruffly, turning back to the stove. "Breakfast is almost ready." Lillian swung her legs over the edge of the bed, keeping the blanket wrapped around her. "Might I trouble you for a comb if you have one?" Thomas gestured toward a shelf near the washstand. "Over there. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up." "It'll be cold, though." "Cold water is a luxury I'm happy to have after yesterday," Lillian replied with a small smile. While Thomas finished breakfast, Lillian made use of the washstand, splashing cold water on her face and combing through her hair with careful strokes. By the time she joined him at the small table, she looked remarkably refreshed, though the borrowed shirt and lack of proper attire clearly made her self-conscious. "I hung your undergarments to dry near the fire," Thomas said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "They should be ready soon. Your dress." He hesitated. "It was ruined by the river, torn in several places." Lillian sighed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I suspected as much. I don't suppose you have any women's clothing hidden away somewhere?" Thomas shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. "Afraid not. But I have some smaller clothes that might do until we can get you to Fort Benton. They'll be too big, but better than nothing." "Thank you." Lillian took a bite of the bacon he'd placed before her. "This is delicious. You really are a fine cook. Necessity, like I said." Thomas ate his own breakfast quickly, accustomed to not lingering over meals. "I checked outside earlier. The snow's still coming down pretty heavy. We won't be going anywhere today, maybe not tomorrow either." Lillian nodded, sipping her coffee. "I hope my uncle won't worry too much when I don't arrive." "Did he know exactly when to expect you?" "No, I wrote that I'd be coming before winter set in, but I didn't specify a date." She frowned slightly. "I should have been more precise." "It's probably better this way," Thomas assured her. "He won't start worrying for a while yet, and by then, I'll have you safely delivered." Lillian set down her coffee cup, her expression suddenly serious. "Tom, I want to thank you properly for everything you've done. When we reach Fort Benton, I'm sure my uncle will want to reward you for saving my life." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I don't want to need a reward, Lillian. I didn't fish you out of that river for payment." "Then why did you?" she asked softly. "You risked your life for a complete stranger." "Why?" Thomas considered the question, surprised to find he didn't have a ready answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," he finally said. "Because I couldn't ride past knowing someone needed help. My father always said that a man's character is defined by what he does when no one's watching." "Your father sounds like a wise man," He was. Thomas stood, gathering their empty plates. I'll find those clothes for you, then maybe we can check if your undergarments are dry. While Lillian finished her coffee, Thomas rummaged through his trunk, pulling out a pair of worn canvas trousers, a cotton shirt, and woolen socks that had shrunk slightly in washing. He presented them to her with an apologetic shrug. It's not exactly ladies' fashion, but they're clean. Lillian accepted the bundle with a smile that transformed her face, lighting her eyes and revealing a dimple in her right cheek. They're perfect, thank you. Thomas nodded, suddenly awkward. I'll go check on Rusty while you change. Just call when you're decent. Outside, the world was transformed into a wonderland of white. At least 6 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight, and it was still coming down steadily. The temperature had dropped further, and Thomas's breath clouded before him as he trudged to the lean-to where Rusty was stabled. The horse nickered a greeting, clearly bored with his confinement. Thomas spent some time with him, brushing his coat and talking softly as he refreshed the hay and water. Usually, he would let Rusty roam a bit, but the deep snow and continuing storm made that unwise. "Sorry, boy," he murmured, patting the horse's neck. "We're all stuck for now." By the time he returned to the cabin, stamping snow from his boots, a good 20 minutes had passed. He knocked before entering, not wanting to intrude if Lillian was still changing. "Come in," she called. Thomas opened the door to find her standing by the fire, dressed in his clothes. The trousers were rolled up several times at the ankles and cinched tight at the waist with a piece of rope. The shirt was similarly oversized, though she'd tucked it in as best she could. Despite the ill-fitting garments, or perhaps because of them, there was something undeniably appealing about the sight. "How do I look?" she asked, spreading her arms with a self-deprecating laugh. "Like a very small lumberjack," Thomas replied with a smile. Lillian laughed again, the sound warm and genuine. "I've been called worse." "It's practical, at least," Thomas said, closing the door against the cold. "And private as we are, who's to judge?" "Indeed." Lillian's smile faded slightly. "Though I confess, the idea of being trapped here for days is somewhat daunting. Not because of the company," she added quickly, "but because I'm not accustomed to idleness." Thomas understood the sentiment well. There's always work to be done, even in a snowstorm. "I need to chop more firewood before the pile on the porch is depleted, and there's mending and cleaning inside." "I'd be happy to help with the indoor tasks," Lillian offered. "It's the least I can do." "You're still recovering," Thomas protested. "You should rest." Lillian shook her head firmly. "I'm much better today, and I'll go mad if I just sit around. Please, let me contribute something." Thomas recognized the pride in her stance. It was a familiar trait to him. "All right," he conceded. "There's darning that needs doing if you're handy with a needle." "Very handy," Lillian confirmed. "I used to make all my own clothes and my father's shirts as well." Thomas retrieved a basket from beneath his bed, containing socks with holes and shirts with missing buttons. "Have at it, then. I'll be outside chopping wood. Call if you need anything." The day passed in a companionable rhythm that surprised them both. Thomas split logs until his arms ached pleasantly, carrying armloads to the growing pile on the porch. Occasionally, he would glance through the window and see Lillian bent over her work, her dark head illuminated by the firelight. When he finally came inside, stomping snow from his boots, the cabin felt different. It was neater, for one thing. The shelves had been organized, the floor swept, and a stew was simmering on the stove, filling the air with a savory aroma. "You've been busy," he observed, hanging his coat by the door. Lillian looked up from her sewing, her cheeks flushed from the fire's heat. "I hope you don't mind. I found some vegetables in your root cellar and thought I'd start dinner." "Mind, I haven't come home to a cooked meal in years." The words slipped out before he could consider them. revealing more than he'd intended about his solitary existence. Something shifted in Lillian's expression, understanding, perhaps, or compassion. "Well, it's nothing fancy. Just potatoes, carrots, and some of that venison you had stored." "It smells wonderful." Thomas moved to the washstand, pouring water into the basin to wash the sweat and sawdust from his face and hands. "How are you feeling now?" "Much better. I think my adventure in the river will leave no lasting harm, thanks to your quick action." Thomas dried his face on a towel, noting that it, too, seemed fresher than before. "You've made yourself quite at home," he remarked, not unkindly. Lillian set aside her mending, suddenly uncertain. "I hope I haven't overstepped." "Not at all," Thomas assured her quickly. "It's nice, actually. The cabin hasn't been this clean since." He trailed off, trying to remember. "Well, possibly ever," Lillian laughed, relaxing again. "Bachelor living has its drawbacks, it seems. More than I realized, apparently." Thomas found himself smiling more than he had in months. There was something about Lillian's presence that lightened the very air around him. They ate dinner at the small table, talking easily about inconsequential things, the weather, the upcoming Christmas holiday, stories of their childhoods. Thomas found himself sharing anecdotes he hadn't thought of in years, drawn out by Lillian's attentive listening and ready laughter. "So there I was," he recounted, gesturing with his spoon, 12 years old, standing in the middle of the creek with my trousers around my ankles, while the teacher and all my classmates stared from the bank. Lillian's laughter rang out, her head thrown back. "What did you do?" "What could I do?" "I pulled up my trousers, soaking wet, and trudged back to shore with as much dignity as I could muster, which wasn't much." Thomas shook his head at the memory. "My brother never let me live it down." "Brothers are like that," Lillian agreed, her laughter subsiding to a warm smile. "I had two, both older. They teased me mercilessly." Thomas noticed the past tense again but didn't comment. Loss was a companion to most in this harsh country. "Were you closed to them?" he asked instead. Lillian's smile turned wistful. "Very. They both joined the Union Army, neither came home." "I'm sorry," Thomas said simply, understanding the grief behind her words better than most could. "It was a long time ago," Lillian replied, though her eyes suggested the pain was still fresh. "Gettysburg, both of them, at least they were together." They sat in silence for a moment, the wind outside and the crackling fire the only sounds. "Is that why you came west?" Thomas finally asked. "After losing so much in the East?" Lillian considered the question, twirling her spoon in her empty bowl. "Partly. There were too many ghosts in Minnesota. My parents' deaths were the final push, but I'd been restless for years." She looked up at him. "What about you? What brought you to Montana Territory?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, gathering his thoughts. "After the war and my mother's death, there wasn't much left for me in Pennsylvania. My brother and I headed west, worked cattle drives for a while. When he got gold fever and left for California, I decided to put down roots here. Found this plot, built the cabin, started raising horses." "You built this cabin yourself?" Lillian looked around with newfound appreciation. "With some help from neighbors for the heavy lifting," Thomas admitted. "But yes, mostly my own work." "It's impressive." Lillian's admiration seemed genuine. "You've created something lasting here." Thomas had never thought of his homestead in those terms before, but hearing her say it filled him with an unexpected sense of pride. "Thank you," he said simply. Later, as they sat before the fire, Thomas smoking his pipe while Lillian finished the last of the mending, a comfortable silence fell between them. It was strange, he thought, how quickly they had established this domestic rhythm, as if they had known each other for years rather than a single day. The storm continued outside, rattling the shutters occasionally with particularly strong gusts. The snow showed no signs of abating. "I think we'll be here tomorrow as well," Thomas observed, tapping his pipe against the hearth to empty it. "The trail to Fort Benton will be impassable until the snow stops and settles a bit." Lillian nodded, setting aside the last darned sock. "I find I'm not as anxious to leave as I perhaps should be," she admitted, then flushed slightly. "That is, I mean to say, your hospitality has made this unexpected delay quite bearable." Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm glad," he said simply, not trusting himself with more words. Their eyes met across the hearth, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, and the surprising ease they had found in each other's company. The moment stretched, charged with possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Finally, Thomas stood, breaking the tension. "We should turn in," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "The days start early here, storm or no storm." Lillian nodded, rising as well. "Of course." "Good night, Tom." "Good night, Lillian." As on the previous night, Thomas waited until Lillian's breathing deepened into sleep before allowing himself to relax. But sleep eluded him, his mind too full of the woman sleeping just a few feet away and the unexpected turn his solitary life had taken. Morning brought no respite from the storm. If anything, the snow fell more heavily, driven sideways by a biting wind that found every crack in the cabin's walls. Thomas stoked the fire higher than usual, trying to combat the chill. Lillian woke to find him at the window, staring out at the white landscape with a concerned expression. "Is something wrong?" she asked, sitting up. Thomas turned at the sound of her voice. "This is turning into quite the blizzard. I need to check on Rusty and make sure the lean-to roof isn't collecting too much snow." "Be careful," Lillian said, concern evident in her voice. "I've heard stories of people getting lost just feet from their own doors in such storms." "I'll tie a rope from the cabin to the lean-to," Thomas assured her. "I'm not planning to join you in the river as the second rescue of the week." Lillian smiled at his attempt at humor, though her worry remained visible. "I'll have coffee waiting when you return." True to his word, Thomas secured a rope to the porch post before venturing into the howling whiteness. The snow was nearly knee-deep now, and the wind cut through his coat like a knife. The short distance to the lean-to felt much longer as he battled the elements. Rusty was agitated, sensing the storm's fury. Thomas spent extra time calming the horse, speaking softly and brushing his coat. He checked the roof, relieved to find it holding strong against the snow's weight, then made his way back to the cabin, following the lifeline of the rope. When he stumbled back inside, snow caked on his clothes and beard, Lillian was waiting with a steaming cup of coffee and a look of relief that warmed him more than the fire. "You're half frozen," she chided, taking his coat and hanging it by the fire. "Sit down before you fall down." Thomas did as instructed, too cold to argue. Lillian pressed the coffee into his hands, then knelt to remove his snow-encrusted boots. The domesticity of the gesture struck him powerfully. "You don't have to do that," he protested. "Hush," Lillian replied, continuing her task. "Your hands are shaking too much to manage the laces anyway." She was right, of course. The bitter cold had numbed his fingers despite his gloves. Once his boots and wet socks were removed, Lillian brought a blanket and wrapped it around his shoulders. "Thank you," Thomas said, sipping the hot coffee gratefully. "You'd make a fine nurse." "I had practiced with my father when he was ill," Lillian replied, sitting across from him. "How is your horse?" "Rusty's fine. Annoyed at being confined, but the lean-to is holding well." Thomas felt warmth returning to his extremities, along with the painful tingling that accompanied it. "This is the worst storm I've seen in years. We could be stuck here for several days." Lillian nodded, accepting this news with surprising equanimity. "Then we'll make the best of it. I saw you have some books on that shelf. Perhaps you wouldn't mind if I borrowed one. Help yourself. Most are practical guides, farming, horse breeding, that sort of thing. But there are a few novels my mother left me." Lillian crossed to the small bookshelf and examined the titles. "Ah, Dickens. I love Great Expectations." She pulled the volume from the shelf, handling it with care. "Was this your mother's?" Thomas nodded, a lump forming unexpectedly in his throat. "She read to us every night, even after we were old enough to read ourselves. Said stories kept the darkness at bay." "A wise woman," Lillian said softly, returning to her seat with the book. "Would you mind if I read aloud for a while? It might pass the time pleasantly." The request surprised Thomas, but he found himself nodding. "I'd like that." And so began a new pattern to their days of confinement. Mornings were spent on necessary tasks, Thomas venturing out briefly to tend to Rusty and bring in more firewood. Lillian keeping the cabin orderly and preparing simple meals from Thomas's stored provisions. Afternoons and evenings were for reading, with Lillian's clear voice bringing Dickens' characters to life while the storm raged outside. Thomas found himself looking forward to these reading sessions more than he would have thought possible. There was something soothing about sitting by the fire, whittling or mending harnesses while Lillian read. Her voice had a musical quality, rising and falling with the story's rhythm, different for each character's dialogue. On the third day of their confinement, as Lillian reached a particularly dramatic moment in the tale, Thomas looked up from the piece of wood he was carving and found himself captivated not by the story, but by the storyteller. The firelight played across her features, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the fullness of her lips as they shaped the words. Her borrowed clothes, rolled and tied to fit her smaller frame, somehow enhanced rather than diminished her femininity. As if sensing his gaze, Lillian glanced up from the page, their eyes meeting. She faltered mid-sentence, a blush rising to her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, marking her place with her finger. "Am I reading too much, your expression?" "No," Thomas said quickly. "I was just thinking how nice this is. Having someone to share the cabin with during the storm, having you here." The words hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Lillian closed the book slowly, keeping her finger at their place. "It is nice," she agreed softly. "I've enjoyed these days more than I would have thought possible, given how they began, as have I." Thomas set aside his whittling. "Lillian, a sudden gust of wind interrupted him, rattling the shutters violently. Both jumped at the sound, the moment broken. "I should check the chimney," Thomas said, rising. "Make sure the snow hasn't blocked it." Lillian nodded, reopening the book. "Of course." The routine of their days continued, but something had shifted between them, a heightened awareness, an unspoken possibility that made even simple interactions charged with meaning. Their hands would brush when passing a plate, and both would pull away as if burned. Their eyes would meet over the fire, and both would look away, unprepared for what they might reveal. On the fifth day, the storm finally began to abate. The snow still fell, but more gently, and the wind had died down to occasional gusts rather than a constant howl. "I think we'll be able to travel tomorrow or the next day," Thomas said, returning from his morning check on Rusty. "The trail will be difficult but passable." Lillian nodded, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. "That's good news," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Your uncle will be relieved to see you," Thomas added, removing his snowy boots by the door. "Yes, of course." Lillian served the oatmeal into 2 bowls, adding a drizzle of honey to each. "I'm sure he's been worried." They ate in silence, the prospect of parting hanging heavy between them. Thomas found himself seeking reasons to delay their journey, even as he knew he should be eager to fulfill his promise of delivering Lillian safely to Fort Benton. "We should wait one more day after the snow stops," he finally said. "Let the trail settle a bit. It will be safer." Lillian looked up, relief evident in her eyes. "If you think that's best." "I do." Thomas pushed his empty bowl away. "Besides, we still haven't finished Great Expectations. I'd like to hear how it ends." Lillian smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing visibly. "Then we'll finish it tonight." The snow stopped entirely by mid-afternoon. The world outside the cabin was transformed into a glistening white expanse, beautiful but treacherous. The sun emerged briefly, setting the snow-covered landscape ablaze with diamond-like sparkles before disappearing behind the mountains. Inside, Thomas and Lillian moved about their tasks with a new awkwardness, aware that their time together was drawing to a close. The easy companionship of the previous days was tinged now with something like regret. After dinner, they settled into their usual positions by the fire for the final chapters of the book. Lillian's voice was subdued as she read, the story's melancholy matching their mood. When she closed the book at last, a heavy silence fell between them. "Well," she said finally, "that's not quite the ending I remembered." "Dickens supposedly wrote two versions," Thomas replied. "A sad one and a happy one. My mother always preferred the hopeful ending." "As do I," Lillian admitted, "though perhaps that's foolish. Life rarely gives us such neat conclusions." Thomas looked at her across the fire, gathering his courage. "Lillian, when we reach Fort Benton—" "Yes," she prompted when he hesitated. "I'd like your permission to call on you there, properly, I mean." The words came out in a rush, as if he feared losing his nerve if he spoke more slowly. Lillian's eyes widened slightly, a flush rising to her cheeks. "You would?" "Yes." Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "These days with you, they've been unexpected, but also the best I've had in longer than I can remember. I'm not ready for them to end completely." A slow smile spread across Lillian's face, transforming her features. "I'm not ready either," she confessed. "I would like very much for you to call on me in Fort Benton." Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. "Good," he said simply, not trusting himself with more elaborate declarations. Lillian's smile deepened, reaching her eyes. "Good," she echoed. The morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue above the snow-covered landscape. Thomas rose early to prepare for their journey, packing provisions and checking Rusty's tack. The horse was eager for exercise after days of confinement, prancing in place as Thomas saddled him. Inside the cabin, Lillian gathered her few possessions, the borrowed clothes she now wore, and her nearly dry undergarments, which she packed carefully in a small bundle. There was little evidence that she had ever been there, and yet Thomas felt her presence would linger long after she was gone. "Are you ready?" he asked, entering the cabin to find her standing by the fire, lost in thought. Lillian turned, composing her features into a smile. "As ready as I can be, considering I'm about to ride into Fort Benton dressed like this." She gestured to her borrowed male attire. "You look fine," Thomas assured her, though fine hardly captured the way the morning light through the window highlighted her features. "And your uncle will be too relieved to see you to care about your clothes." "I suppose you're right." Lillian picked up her small bundle. "Thank you for everything, Tom, for saving my life, for your hospitality, for—" She gestured around the cabin, encompassing the days they had shared. "You're welcome," Thomas replied, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "Are you warm enough? The ride will be cold." "I'm wearing 3 shirts and your spare coat. I think I'll manage." Her smile turned teasing. "Unless you're looking for an excuse to delay our departure." Thomas felt heat rise to his face, caught in his transparent attempt. "Maybe," he admitted. But the daylight won't wait for us, and it's a long ride to Fort Benton. The journey was indeed challenging. The trail was buried under nearly 2 feet of snow in places, forcing them to proceed slowly. Rusty was strong but burdened with both riders, and Thomas frequently dismounted to lead the horse through particularly deep drifts. They spoke little during the journey, conserving energy for the physical demands of travel. Lillian sat behind Thomas on the horse, her arms around his waist for balance. Even through layers of clothing, her presence against his back was a distraction Thomas tried not to dwell on. By mid-afternoon, they began to see signs of civilization smoke from distant chimneys, fences partially visible above the snow. Fort Benton itself appeared on the horizon as the sun began its descent, the buildings clustered along the frozen Missouri River. "We made it," Thomas said, pausing to let Lillian see the town. "Your uncle's place, do you know where it is?" "He wrote that he lives above his store on Front Street," Lillian replied. "Davies General Merchandise," Thomas nodded. "I know it, good store." "Your uncle is a respected businessman in these parts." They continued into town, drawing curious glances from the few people braving the cold. A woman riding double with a man, dressed in men's clothing, was an unusual sight even in a frontier town accustomed to oddities. Davies General Merchandise was easy to spot, a 2-story building with large windows displaying dry goods and hardware. A bell jingled as Thomas pushed open the door, ushering Lillian inside. An elderly man looked up from behind the counter, his spectacles perched low on his nose. He was tall and lean, with a full white beard and kind eyes that widened in shock as he recognized his visitor despite her unusual attire. "Lillian," he exclaimed, coming around the counter with surprising agility for his age. "Good heavens, child, is that you? Uncle Henry?" Lillian rushed forward into his outstretched arms. "Yes, it's me. I'm sorry if I gave you a fright." "A fright? My dear girl, I've been beside myself with worry." Henry Davies held her at arm's length, examining her face. "Your letter said you'd arrive before the first heavy snow, and when the storm hit with no word from you." He shook his head, emotion making his voice rough. "But here you are, safe and sound, if somewhat strangely attired." Lillian laughed, the sound brightening the store. "It's a long story, Uncle Henry. This is Thomas Zachary," she added, turning to include Thomas in the conversation. "He saved my life." Henry looked at Thomas with new interest. "Did he now? Then I am deeply in your debt, Mr. Zachary." Thomas removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. "No debt, sir. Anyone would have done the same." "I doubt that very much," Henry replied, extending his hand. "Please come upstairs. You both look half frozen, and I want to hear this story in full." The apartment above the store was warm and comfortably furnished, with a large fireplace and well-worn leather chairs. Henry bustled about, preparing coffee and producing a plate of biscuits while Lillian explained their extraordinary meeting and the days that followed. "So you see, Uncle," she concluded, "I lost everything in the river, the wagon, my clothes, all the household goods I brought from Minnesota. Even the money from the farm sale was in my trunk." Henry shook his head, though his expression showed more relief than distress. "Things can be replaced, my dear. You cannot, if not for Mr. Zachary's timely intervention and care." He turned to Thomas, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Young man, I cannot thank you enough. Name your reward, and if it's in my power to give, it's yours." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "As I told Lillian, I don't want a reward, Mr. Davies. I'm just glad I was there to help." "Nevertheless," Henry insisted, "my gratitude must take some form. At the very least, you must allow me to replace any provisions that were consumed during Lillian's stay, and to pay for your trouble in bringing her to town." Seeing that the older man would not be dissuaded, Thomas nodded. "That's very generous, thank you. But truly, it was no trouble." Henry studied Thomas thoughtfully, his gaze moving between the young man and his niece, noting something in their manner toward each other. "Well then, you must join us for Christmas dinner next week. I insist." Thomas glanced at Lillian, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. "I'd be honored, sir." As the afternoon waned, Thomas became aware that he should take his leave. Lillian needed rest and time to settle in with her uncle, and he had chores waiting at his own homestead. "I should be heading back," he said, rising from his chair. "I want to reach home before dark." "Of course," Henry agreed. "Though you're welcome to stay the night in town if you wish. The hotel has vacancies, I'm sure, and I'd happily cover the cost. Thank you, but Rusty knows the way home, even in the snow. We'll manage." Thomas turned to Lillian, suddenly awkward in her uncle's presence. "Miss Davies, I'm glad you're safely delivered to your family." Lillian stood as well, her eyes conveying more than her formal words. "Mr. Zachary, I cannot thank you enough for all you've done. I hope we'll see you at Christmas, if not before." "You will," Thomas promised. He extended his hand to Henry. "Mr. Davies, it was a pleasure to meet you despite the circumstances." "Likewise, young man. Safe journey home." Lillian insisted on walking Thomas down to his horse, despite her uncle's protest that she should rest. As they stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, a new shyness fell between them, the ease of their days together temporarily displaced by the return to societal norms. "You'll really come for Christmas?" Lillian asked, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Thomas replied, adjusting Rusty's saddle. "Though I might need to find some better clothes. These won't do for a proper dinner." Lillian smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I don't know. I've grown rather fond of this rugged look." Thomas returned her smile, emboldened by her teasing tone. "And I've grown rather fond of you, Lillian Davies." A blush spread across her cheeks, visible even in the dim light. "As I have of you, Thomas Zachary." For a moment they stood there, the busy street and curious onlookers forgotten. Thomas wanted to take her hand, to pull her close, but propriety held him back. There would be time for such gestures, he told himself. Time to court her properly with her uncle's blessing. "I'll see you at Christmas," he said instead, mounting Rusty with practiced ease. "Perhaps before, if the weather holds." "I'll look forward to it," Lillian replied, stepping back from the horse. "Godspeed, Tom." "Take care, Lillian." With a tip of his hat, Thomas turned Rusty toward home, already counting the days until he would see her again. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a flurry of activity for both Thomas and Lillian. At his homestead, Thomas threw himself into preparing for winter in earnest, chopping extra firewood, mending fences damaged by the storm, and ensuring his small herd of horses had adequate shelter and feed for the cold months ahead. In Fort Benton, Lillian was settling into life with her uncle. Henry Davies, overjoyed at his niece's safe arrival and eager to make her feel welcome, had taken her on a shopping expedition the very day after her arrival. The general store's stock, combined with orders from a dressmaker in town, soon provided Lillian with a new wardrobe to replace what she had lost in the river. Working in the store alongside, her uncle proved more satisfying than Lillian had anticipated. Henry was a fair and generous employer, well liked by his customers, and Lillian's natural warmth and efficiency quickly made her a valued addition to the business. The days passed quickly, filled with new faces and the challenges of learning the trade. But in quiet moments, Lillian found her thoughts returning to the cabin by the river and the man who had saved her life. The memory of those days, isolated from the world by snow and circumstance, had taken on a dreamlike quality. Had it really only been a week since Thomas had pulled her from the freezing water? Sometimes it seemed like years ago, other times like yesterday. "You're miles away, my dear," Henry observed one evening as they sat by the fire after closing the store. "Thinking of your young man, perhaps?" Lillian startled, her cheeks warming. "He's not my young man, Uncle Henry." "No." Henry's eyes twinkled with amusement. "My old eyes must be failing me then, because I could have sworn I saw something between you two." Lillian busied herself with her embroidery, avoiding her uncle's knowing gaze. "We spent 5 days together in his cabin during the storm. We became friends." "Friends," Henry repeated, his tone suggesting he didn't believe that was the whole story. "Well, he seems a fine young man. Honest, hardworking. I've heard good things about him from others in town. Builds excellent horses, they say." "He does," Lillian agreed, remembering how Thomas had spoken of his small breeding operation with quiet pride. "He's very knowledgeable about them. And rather handsome too, I might add," Henry continued, his smile widening as Lillian's blush deepened. "Ah, youth. I remember when your Aunt Catherine and I were courting. I couldn't think straight for weeks." Lillian set aside her embroidery, giving up the pretense of indifference. "Do you think it's too soon? We barely know each other." Henry considered the question thoughtfully. "Time is measured differently out here than back east. Life is harder, more precarious. People learn to recognize what matters quickly." He reached over to pat her hand. "What matters is character, and your Thomas showed his when he risked his life to save a stranger. The rest you can discover together, if you're both willing." "He said he wants to call on me properly," Lillian admitted. "Then I'd say you have your answer about his intentions." Henry settled back in his chair with a satisfied nod. "I look forward to having him at our Christmas table." Thomas, meanwhile, had made his own preparations for that Christmas dinner. A trip to Helena, the nearest town with a proper tailor, had yielded a new suit not fancy by Eastern standards, but respectable enough for a holiday meal with the woman who had come to occupy his thoughts nearly constantly. He had also, after much deliberation, begun work on a special gift for Lillian. His skills as a woodworker were modest compared to his abilities with horses, but the small box taking shape beneath his knife was crafted with care and attention to detail that made up for any technical shortcomings. The day before Christmas, Thomas made his final preparations. He bathed thoroughly, trimmed his beard, and polished his boots to a shine that would have satisfied even his military father. The gift for Lillian, wrapped carefully in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon, was tucked safely in his saddlebag along with small tokens for her uncle, a bottle of fine whiskey, and a pouch of tobacco he'd been saving for a special occasion. The morning of Christmas dawned clear and cold, the sun glinting off the pristine snow. Thomas set out early, wanting to allow plenty of time for the journey to Fort Benton. Rusty, recently groomed and seemingly aware of the importance of the day, carried him proudly through the winter landscape. They reached town by early afternoon, as planned. Thomas stabled Rusty at the town livery, paying extra to ensure the horse received proper care, then walked the short distance to Davies' general merchandise, his gifts under one arm and his heart pounding with anticipation. The store was closed for the holiday, but a wreath of pine boughs adorned the door, and warm light spilled from the windows of the apartment above. Thomas climbed the exterior stairs and knocked, suddenly feeling as nervous as a schoolboy. The door opened to reveal Lillian, and Thomas's carefully prepared greeting died on his lips. She wore a dress of deep green that complemented her eyes, her dark hair arranged in soft curls around her face. She was, he thought, the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. "Tom." Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You came. I said I would," he managed, finding his voice at last. "Merry Christmas, Lillian, Merry Christmas." She stepped back, gesturing for him to enter. "Please come in. Uncle Henry is just finishing in the kitchen." The apartment was transformed for the holiday. Pine garlands draped the mantel, candles glowed on every surface, and the aroma of roasting turkey filled the air. A small tree stood in the corner, decorated with paper stars and strings of cranberries. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, taking it all in. "I haven't seen Christmas done properly in years." "Neither have I," Lillian admitted. "Uncle Henry went to great lengths this year. I think he's making up for all the Christmases we missed together." Henry emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on an apron. "Thomas, welcome, my boy." "Right on time, sir." Thomas shook the older man's extended hand. "Thank you for having me. These are for you." He presented the whiskey and tobacco with a slight bow. "And this," he added, turning to Lillian with the wrapped box, "is for you." Lillian accepted the gift with surprise. "Tom, you shouldn't have. I didn't expect." "Open it later," Thomas suggested, suddenly self-conscious about the modesty of his handmade offering. "It's nothing grand." "I'm sure it's lovely," Lillian replied, setting the package carefully on a side table. "I have something for you, too." "After dinner, perhaps?" The meal that followed was the finest Thomas had eaten in longer than he could remember. Henry proved to be an excellent cook, the turkey perfectly roasted, accompanied by potatoes, gravy, and vegetables from his root cellar. The whiskey Thomas had brought was opened and served, toasts were made, and conversation flowed easily among the three of them. Thomas found himself relaxing as the meal progressed, drawn out of his usual reserve by Henry's warmth and Lillian's presence. He shared stories of his life before Montana, of his father's service in the war, of his brother's adventures in California. In turn, he learned more about Lillian's childhood in Minnesota, her parents, and the brothers she had lost at Gettysburg. By the time Henry brought out a dried fruit pudding for dessert, Thomas felt as if he had known them both for years rather than days. "I propose a toast," Henry said, raising his glass. "To new beginnings, to family both born and found, and to the remarkable chain of events that brought us together this Christmas." "Hear, hear," Thomas agreed, raising his own glass. His eyes met Lillian's across the table, and the connection between them felt tangible, a current of understanding and possibility. After dinner, Henry insisted on clearing the table himself, shooing the younger pair into the sitting room with thinly veiled matchmaking intent. Left alone by the fire, Thomas and Lillian found themselves suddenly shy again, the ease of their dinner conversation momentarily suspended. "Would you like to open your gift now?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Lillian nodded, retrieving the package from the side table. "And you should open yours." She reached beneath the small tree and produced a package wrapped in blue paper. "It isn't much, but I thought of you when I saw it." They exchanged packages, each watching as the other carefully unwrapped their gift. Thomas was methodical, untying the ribbon and folding back the paper to reveal a leather-bound journal and a fine fountain pen. "This is beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the embossed cover. "How did you know I kept a journal?" Lillian smiled, pleased by his reaction. "I noticed your old one on the shelf in your cabin. The cover was falling apart and the pages were nearly full. I thought you might appreciate a new one." "It's perfect," Thomas assured her, touched by her thoughtfulness. "Thank you." Lillian turned her attention to her own gift, unwrapping it with delicate care. Inside the brown paper was a wooden box, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. The lid was carved with an intricate pattern of flowing water and river reeds, the craftsmanship simple but expressive. "Oh, Tom," she breathed, tracing the carving with her fingertip. "Did you make this?" Thomas nodded, watching her face anxiously. "Open it," he urged. Lillian lifted the lid to reveal a delicate silver chain supporting a small pendant, a polished river stone of deep blue-green, wrapped in silver wire. The stone caught the firelight, revealing flecks of gold within its depths. "It's the color of the river," she said softly, understanding immediately. "Where you found me." "I collected a few stones from the bank that day," Thomas explained. "This one reminded me of your eyes. A jeweler in Helena said it for me." Lillian lifted the necklace from the box, holding it up to the light. "It's beautiful. Will you help me put it on?" Thomas took the chain from her hands, his fingers brushing hers in a touch that sent warmth through his entire body. Lillian turned, presenting her back to him and lifting her hair to expose her neck. The intimacy of the gesture was not lost on Thomas as he fastened the clasp, resisting the urge to let his fingers linger on the soft skin revealed above her collar. "There," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Lillian turned back to face him, the pendant resting just below her throat. "How does it look?" "Perfect," Thomas replied, though his eyes were on her face rather than the necklace. "Lillian." The sound of Henry returning from the kitchen interrupted what Thomas had been about to say. The older man paused in the doorway, observing the scene before him with undisguised approval. "Don't mind me," he said, waving away their startled looks. "Pretend I'm not even here." "Impossible, Uncle Henry," Lillian replied with a laugh, though her cheeks were flushed. "Come see what Tom made for me." The evening continued pleasantly, with Henry regaling them with tales of Christmases past and his early days in the territory. As the hour grew late, Thomas reluctantly acknowledged that he should begin his journey home. "Stay the night," Henry suggested. "We have a spare room and the trail will be treacherous in the dark." Thomas was tempted but shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to check on my horses. They'll be expecting their evening feed." "Of course," Henry conceded. "A responsible man puts his animals' needs first, but promise you'll be careful on the trail." "I will, sir." Thomas stood, collecting his hat and coat. "Thank you for your hospitality. This has been the finest Christmas I've had in many years." "You're welcome in our home any time, Thomas," Henry replied, shaking his hand warmly. "I mean that sincerely." Lillian walked with Thomas to the door, while Henry tactfully busied himself adding logs to the fire. In the small entryway they faced each other, so much still unspoken between them. "Thank you for coming today," Lillian said, her hand going to the pendant at her throat. "And for this, I'll treasure it always." "Lillian," Thomas began, summoning his courage. "I meant what I said about calling on you properly. With your uncle's blessing, I'd like to court you if you're willing." Lillian's eyes shone in the dim light. "I'm very willing, Tom. In fact, I've been hoping you would say that." Thomas felt his heart lighten, a smile spreading across his face. "Then may I call on you this Sunday? Perhaps take you for a sleigh ride if the weather permits." "I'd like that very much." Lillian stepped closer, her upturned face an invitation that Thomas couldn't resist. He bent his head, his lips meeting hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Lillian responded with a sweetness that made his heart race, her hands coming to rest lightly on his chest. The kiss was brief, proper enough not to scandalize her uncle if he happened to glance their way, but it sealed a promise between them more binding than any words could express. "Sunday," Thomas whispered as they parted. "I'll count the hours." "As will I," Lillian replied, her smile illuminating the dimly lit entryway. "Safe journey home, Tom." The winter passed in a haze of courtship that warmed even the coldest days. Every Sunday without fail, Thomas made the journey to Fort Benton, sometimes staying the night at the hotel if weather threatened, other times making the return journey by moonlight, his heart too full of Lillian to feel the cold. They went sleigh riding, attended church services together, and shared meals with her increasingly approving uncle. As winter deepened, their feelings deepened too, growing from initial attraction into something more substantial, a partnership based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values. By early March, as the first hints of spring began to soften the snow-covered landscape, Thomas knew with certainty that Lillian was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. The only question remaining was whether she felt the same certainty about him. He found his answer one Sunday afternoon as they walked along the partially thawed Missouri River. The air was cold but promising, carrying the scent of wet earth and renewal. Lillian's hand was warm in his, their steps matched in comfortable rhythm. "I've been thinking," Thomas began, gathering his courage, "about the future." Lillian glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the blue of the sky above. "What about it?" "My homestead is taking shape nicely. The horse breeding business is growing. I've saved enough to build additions to the cabin, another bedroom, a larger kitchen." He paused, his heart pounding. "What I lack is someone to share it with." Lillian stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Tom, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Thomas took both her hands in his, looking into her eyes with all the love and certainty he felt. "Lillian Davies, from the moment I pulled you from that river, my life has been changed. I can't imagine going back to what it was before, empty rooms and silent evenings. I love you. Will you marry me?" Tears sprang to Lillian's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes, Thomas Zachary. Yes, with all my heart." Thomas pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the joy and promise of their shared future. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I should ask your uncle for his blessing," he murmured. Lillian laughed, the sound like music in the crisp spring air. "He's been expecting this for weeks. I think he had us married in his mind from the day you brought me to his door." "Smart man," Thomas replied with a grin. "Though I doubt even he could have predicted how we'd meet." "Providence," Lillian said softly, touching the river stone pendant she still wore daily. "Or fate. Whatever it was, I'm grateful." They were married in late April, as the last of the snow melted, and the first wildflowers began to bloom in the meadows surrounding Thomas's homestead. The ceremony was small but joyful, held in the Fort Benton church with Henry beaming proudly as he gave his niece away. Lillian wore a simple white dress made by the local seamstress, her dark hair adorned with spring blossoms, the river stone pendant nestled at her throat. Thomas, in his best suit, watched her walk down the aisle with wonder in his eyes, still hardly able to believe that this remarkable woman had chosen to share his life. Their vows were traditional but spoken with deep personal meaning, each word a covenant they intended to honor through all the seasons of their lives together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering of friends and townspeople erupted in cheers. The celebration continued at Henry's store, transformed for the occasion with flowers and ribbons. There was food and music, laughter and dancing that lasted well into the evening. But as the sun began to set, the newlyweds slipped away, eager to begin their life together in the cabin that had witnessed the beginning of their extraordinary love story. Thomas had worked tirelessly in the weeks leading up to the wedding, adding the promised bedroom and expanding the kitchen. With Lillian's dowry from her uncle, a generous sum that had surprised them, both they had purchased new furniture, curtains, and the 100 small items that transform a bachelor's quarters into a family home. Still, it was the familiar main room that welcomed them that evening, the hearth where they had spent those storm-bound days now crackling with a welcoming fire. Thomas lifted Lillian over the threshold with ceremony, both of them laughing as he nearly stumbled. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zachary," he said, setting her down gently. Lillian looked around the cabin, her eyes bright with emotion. "It feels like coming full circle," she observed. "From that first night when you pulled me from the river to now beginning our life together in the same place." "A better beginning this time," Thomas replied, drawing her into his arms. "Though I wouldn't change how we met, not for anything." "Nor would I," Lillian agreed, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "Every moment led us here." The years that followed were full in the way that well-lived lives are full, with work and purpose, joy and occasional sorrow, and above all, with love that deepened with each passing season. The horse breeding business prospered under Thomas's careful management, with Lillian proving to have a natural affinity for the animals and a head for the business side of the operation. Henry eventually sold his store and moved to the homestead, building a small cottage nearby where he could enjoy his retirement while still being close to the family that had come to mean everything to him. Children arrived, first a son they named after Thomas's father, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's green eyes and spirit. The cabin expanded again and again to accommodate their growing family, eventually becoming a proper ranch house with rooms for all. But through all the changes and expansions, they preserved the original hearth where Thomas had once placed a half-drowned Lillian to warm by the fire. It remained the heart of their home, just as the story of her rescue became the heart of their family lore, told and retold to children and eventually grandchildren. "Tell us again, Grandpa," the children would beg on winter evenings, gathered around that same hearth. "Tell us how you saved Grandma from the freezing river." And Thomas, his hair now silver but his eyes still bright, would look across at Lillian, her own dark hair threaded with gray, the river stone pendant still at her throat, and begin the tale that had shaped both their lives. "It was the coldest December anyone could remember," he would say. "The wind was howling like a wounded animal, but somehow, through that awful noise, I heard something else, a cry for help that changed everything." Lillian would smile, her hand finding his across the space between their chairs, a touch that still held all the warmth and promise of that first Christmas so many years before. In that touch was the acknowledgement of a simple truth, that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with a single act of courage, and the greatest love stories start in the most unexpected circumstances, even in the freezing waters of a Montana river in the winter of 1873.